And welcome to Law and Crime Now, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. We begin with an update in the Ahmaud Arbery case out of Georgia. This was the young man who was gunned down on viral video. Travis and Gregory McMichael, as well as William Roddy Bryan, currently sit in jail on murder, assault, and false imprisonment charges. Now, although we are dealing with three white men who are accused of killing a black man, their attorneys sat down recently for a new interview and said that race did not play a factor in this case. Rather, this is a situation where you have neighbors who were concerned that Arbery was a burglar. Now, you might recall that surveillance video shows Arbery, or someone who appears to be Arbery, as well as others, going onto this property that was under construction. Now, Travis McMichael's attorney even went so far to say that William Bryan lied to investigators about his client making a racial slur. Which racial slur? Let's go back to Agent Richard Dial, who explained it further.
Stated on the crime scene that was overheard by one of the defendants and shared with investigators prior to police arriving, correct?
That's correct, yes, sir.
And though this may be an uncomfortable conversation for the benefit of the court and for the record, we're making it clear that this is not your quote, it's not the GBI's quote. This is a quote from a statement of Mr. Bryan as to what he heard Travis McMichael say prior to police arriving, correct?
Very much so, yes, sir.
Understanding that and understanding that it might be a little uncomfortable to talk about the words because it involves a curse word and something else, I need to ask you about that quote. Can you please articulate for the court what Mr. Bryan said he heard Travis McMichael say prior to police arriving and after the fatal shooting?
Yes, Mr. Bryan said that after the shooting took place, before police arrival, while Mr. Arbery was on the ground, that he heard Travis McMichael make the statement, "fucking."
All right, let's get into it right now. Joining me is law and crime legal analyst and criminal defense attorney Julie Rendelman, as well as criminal defense attorney Gabriela Teresa Gonzalez. Great to have you both here. Let's get right into it. Julie, I'll start with you with what we just heard. So you have Travis McMichael's attorney saying that William Bryan lied about making this statement, that Travis McMichael never said this. And again, you have these attorneys who sat down for an interview with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and said he lied about this in order to get a better deal with prosecutors. Clearly that didn't work. Bryan sits in jail. He's facing serious charges. He's, denied bond. But what do you make of that allegation by one of the defense attorneys?
Look, I mean, they're defending their client. Keep in mind that, we haven't heard yet, the testimony of Roddy Bryan. And even though he hasn't curried favor yet, it doesn't mean he's still not trying to curry favor. And I think in many ways, I think that the prosecutor may very well need him in terms of putting together certain pieces of the case that they can't necessarily get without him. So at the end of the day, while it didn't work initially, it may work in terms of getting him a deal in the end.
So Bob Rubin, who is representing Travis McMichael, he said you could feel the world gasping, we gasp, but when you look at what's actually happening, it can't be true, and I don't think it's true, meaning his client making that racial slur. Now, Gigi, I turn it over to you. Overall, you have these attorneys who sat down for this interview and have really tried to stress that race was not a factor here, that this wasn't an issue where they woke up one day and wanted to target a black man. Why do you think they did this interview, maybe at this point in the case? Is there some strategy overall about what they're trying to do?
Yes, absolutely. This is a case that has received international attention. Okay, Ahmaud Arbery's death has rang throughout the entire world. So the defense attorneys, it would behoove them to take their position on the world stage to assert their client's innocence. And it's important for them to downplay the role of race in this case, because that's what really sparked this international attention, was the fact that you had these vigilantes patrolling the neighborhood and characterizing a black man running as a dangerous felon and executing him. So it is to the defense's benefit to downplay the role of race.
But is it also the timing of this, Julie? Because we know that the McMichaels are seeking to be bonded out. They're seeking pretrial release. I know they've requested an upcoming hearing. So is it, hey, why don't we sit down for an interview, have this come out, keep downplaying that our client is this kind of monster that has been portrayed to be, or that our clients have been portrayed to be, in light of this hearing?
Sure. Obviously, there's always an agenda when you make a decision as a defense attorney to speak in public about your client's case. And, keep in mind that, no matter what we've seen in terms of the video, we all have to recognize that at the end of the day, a jury makes the final decision as to whether or not they are guilty and not guilty. And by the way, whether race played a role or not, it still wouldn't mean that they're innocent. We have to not forget that. I think most of us, when we view this, we believe that race played a role. But even if it didn't, it doesn't make them not guilty.
Yeah, because you could have a situation where, let's say we put race to the side, you still have people taking the law into their own hands, vigilante justice, and whatever they believed. And here you have a situation where, is that legal or not? Take the motivation away. Is it legal to do what they are accused of doing? Now, we do want to focus on the racial aspect for one last instant. We talk about Travis McMichael. Let's not forget that Agent Richard Dial also said there's evidence that William Bryan, again, the man who accused Travis McMichael of making this racial slur, that he himself was racially motivated. Watch.
Is there any evidence of racial animus on the part of Roddy Bryan against Mr. Arbery?
Specifically against Mr. Arbery or in general?
That's the first question, specifically against Mr. Arbery.
I've seen no communications involving that with in regards to Mr. Arbery. No, sir.
Very good. Has your investigation uncovered any evidence that race played a role in the actions of Roddy Bryan on 2/23/20?
Mr. Goff, I'm trying to answer your question as thoroughly as I can. Revealed, as far as my opinion of motivation and reasons behind actions?
Well, I'll take your opinion first.
Yes, sir, it did.
You believe it did?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, following up on your opinion, is there any evidence that race played a role in the actions of Roddy Bryan on 2/23/20?
There is evidence that of Roddy Bryan's racist attitude in his communications.
Okay.
And from that, I extrapolate the reason why he made assumptions he did that day of what was occurring. He saw a man running down the road with the truck falling, and I believe he made certain assumptions that were at least in part based upon his racial bias.
So we'll keep our eyes on what happens in that case, but we want to move from there to another case we've been following, Ghislaine Maxwell, the British socialite currently locked up on federal sex crimes and perjury charges for her alleged role in recruiting minors to be abused by Jeffrey Epstein and others. Well, The Sun has reported that Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, may have financed Jeffrey Epstein at the beginning of his operations. Let's start with that. So, Gabriella, this is big. This is an interesting thing to think about because we knew that Ghislaine Maxwell was, at the very least, an associate of Jeffrey Epstein, at the utmost, a conspirator with him or an accomplice, a former girlfriend. But now the idea that this relationship is somehow fueled or somehow supplied by Maxwell's family, that's a big development. And on top of the fact that, there's been reports that there is a source or an insider talking about this who's working with government lawyers, have maybe provided sworn testimony on this. If this is true, what does this tell you about the case?
Deeply embedded with Jeffrey Epstein even before she chose to be. This was a family connection between her father, Mr. Maxwell, and Jeffrey Epstein. And the fact that Mr. Maxwell was supplying funds for Jeffrey Epstein to either invest, or we have no idea what Jeffrey Epstein did with the money, if he acted as if it was his own and just converted it, who knows? But what this tells us is that the Maxwells have been deeply embedded with Epstein for much longer and in a much more serious way than just an aloof party goer at Epstein's house every now and then.
And it kind of fuels into the narrative here of shady business dealings. We know Robert Maxwell had a trouble history himself, and everybody's wondering, where did Epstein get all this money? So there's a bunch of updates here, and I want to keep going on because accuser Virginia Giuffre, who said that Prince Andrew, and she's a victim of Prince Andrew, Epstein, as well as Alan Dershowitz, she came out and she tweeted something. And Julie, I want to pay attention to this. Let's put it up on the screen, where she tweeted seemingly to Ghislaine Maxwell, "Are you saving your own skin and naming names? I know you only care about yourself and you hold all the secrets. I go to bed at night thanking God you are sleeping in a cage, just like the one you put me and hundreds other in. Hashtag save our children." Okay, so Julie, I turn to you. Why do you think Virginia Giuffre wrote this? And I'll ask you this. Do you think she's partially motivated? Because right now, her legal team is opposing Maxwell's attempt to keep Maxwell's 2016 deposition sealed. We all recall that at one point, Giuffre had actually sued Maxwell for defamation. That was settled. And now there's a big issue about trying to get that deposition testimony in. Do you think that's motivated by this in some way?
Yeah, I think there's several motivations. One of the other motivations is that, a lot of people want to hear from Ghislaine Maxwell, and one of them is Giuffre, because that could corroborate what Giuffre's been saying all along in terms of all these different individuals being involved in this. And so it helps Giuffre's cause also, because there's been a lot of questions as to her credibility. Alan Dershowitz has questioned her credibility. Many others have. So if Miss Maxwell spoke out, that could corroborate. It could hurt her, but it could also corroborate.
I mean, it's the million-dollar question right now. The million-dollar question is, at this point, from when her trial ultimately happens, has she been cooperating with investigators? What does she want to keep private? Well, we'll wait and see what happens next. But when we come back from our break, we're going to move from one case of sexual assault to another alleged case of sexual assault. Judge Andrew Napolitano. We'll be back after this.
Them. Let me tell you what's odd about this case. I've never heard of a rape case investigated by the police for 5 years where not a single cop testified. No detectives testified. It leads me to believe that there must have been a breakdown between the prosecutor's office and the police, because they always want police to say, yes, that's what she told me. Yes, that's what she told me. Yes, this is the evidence that corroborates what she said. None of that came in.
Will any police testify in a potential trial for Fox News personality Judge Andrew Napolitano? That becomes the question, because he himself has been accused of sexual abuse. A man named Charles Corbishley claims that he was forced to perform sex acts in exchange for the then Judge Napolitano handing down a lenient sentence for arson charges. And this is all part of a new $10 million lawsuit levied against Fox News' judicial analyst. So Napolitano has refuted these allegations, Gigi, but how should we be thinking about this? Because it's interesting to think about this. The first time I've ever heard of an allegation like this against Napolitano. And we have to also think that Corbishley is a guy who pled guilty to laundering money as a part of prostitution operations. And now he's claiming this. But on the other hand, a lenient sentence, Napolitano handed down probation and community service for these arson charges. So is this true? Is it not true? What do you make of it, Gigi?
I want to go into the sentence for the arsons. All right, we have a 20-year-old youthful offender who is sentenced to 5 years probation and 150 community service hours. I don't know what the arsons entailed, but I do have to wonder, is that really lenient when you take into consideration that the goal of sentences is to rehabilitate somebody, and you have a young guy here who, might have been coerced, or we don't know the circumstances, but was that really lenient? I don't know. Also, just looking at it at the light most favorable to Judge Napolitano, this is an accusation that existed this is stemming from an instance from the 80s, right, where we haven't heard anything about it, like you said, since just recently. It's going to be really hard to develop the evidence to support this allegation. And, I do wonder where the plaintiff is coming from as far as coming out today with this allegation.
Julie, is this a waiting game? Is this something where, if this is a one-off, clearly it's a better shot for Napolitano to fight this and say it's false? But what happens if in the coming days, the coming weeks, more people come forward? Does that change the story here? Because again, this literally, as far as I came out of left field.
we know that over the past couple years, there's been a huge change in the ability, specifically the law has changed in the ability of individuals to be able to come forward during a longer period of time for events that happened when they were much younger. And this falls into that. It doesn't fall into it criminally, but at least civilly. And so we always have to take everything seriously. When we hear of accusations, we take them seriously. But I'm certainly very cautious in making sure everyone understands it's an allegation. And until there's evidence that supports it, I'm going to wait until I give any opinion. And so we may see evidence that supports this. We may never see. We may see 10 people come forward and don't believe any of them. So I think it's just a waiting game to see if the evidence will in fact support that, if anything happened at all.
Gigi, let me give you the final word real quick. Fox News said Judge Napolitano has assured us in the strongest possible terms that these allegations are false and he will fight them aggressively in court. What does Fox News do at this point?
I'm not sure. First of all, Fox News statements based on the credibility of their news reporters, I have to question that, because it seems that that is something that is rampant in the culture of Fox News. We hear left and right of their contributors, of their analysts being accused of serious sexual accusations. So, I don't think that necessarily serves the judge well in this case. But I think it would behoove Fox to just sit and wait for either more evidence or more allegations to come out, if they even do.
Yeah, it's going to be one to watch. And, speaking about watching and things that really take our interest, let's just go back to something that happened with George Floyd, because I want to finalize our show tonight with the 4 former officers who had been charged and have been charged in connection with Floyd's death. They had a motion hearing, and all eyes were on Minnesota for this. And after all, we're talking about the case that ultimately started all the protests and even the riots that occurred here and abroad. And just to give you a sense of what this was like, Benjamin Crump, who is representing Floyd's family, this is what he had to say outside of court.
It is a blatant attempt to kill George Floyd a second time. They kill our person and then they assassinate our character. And that will not hold, because everybody saw that video, not just across Minneapolis, not just across Minnesota, not just across America, but all across the world. The whole world is watching. 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 The whole.
All right, that happened outside the court. Now let's talk about what happened inside the court, because one of the biggest things that happened during this motion hearing is that Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman and several of his staff attorneys were officially disqualified from prosecuting this case by the court. They got kicked off because they apparently had a private meeting with the medical examiner 2 days after Floyd's death. The judge even called this sloppy, what they did. Now, Freeman, his office issued a statement saying, any suggestion by Judge Cahill that the work of Sweezy and Lofton was sloppy is incorrect. The Hennepin County Attorney's Office fully stands by the work, dedication, and commitment of 2 of the state's best prosecutors. Julie, let's talk about that statement. What'd you make of it?
I'm missing something. It's very rare that you see a prosecutor be removed for speaking privately to a medical examiner. I mean, I was a homicide prosecutor for years. I spoke to the medical examiner all the time. I didn't have any individuals with me. And in fact, in this case, it sounds like there were several. So I'm missing something. I do want to go back to one thing with regards to what Ben Crump said. At the end of the day, we have to remember something, that we don't decide the fate of these defendants. A jury does. A jury has to decide whether or not the people have proven beyond a reasonable doubt, not just that the defendant intended to kill him, but that they actually caused his death. And the defense has a right to refute that. That is their job, and that is what they're supposed to do. And so to say that they're not allowed to do that seems a bit unfair in terms of the justice system.
But what are we talking about here, Gigi? Are we talking about the fact, is the implication here that the prosecution met with the medical examiner to influence that report? Because we know that the medical examiner came forward, or at least thought that fentanyl may have played a role in what happened to Floyd, because there was a high level of fentanyl in the system, but didn't go so far to say that that was the direct cause of Floyd's death. and ultimately it was ruled that it was the officers who were responsible for the death. So is the idea here, hey, prosecution, you made a mistake by having a private meeting with the medical examiner regarding an issue or potentially about an issue that could be the whole case. Is that what we're talking about here, Gigi?
No, no, we're not. And it's not uncommon, just like Julie said, for prosecutors and medical examiners to meet to discuss how to move forward on a case. That's not unusual. What I think is sloppy here is the ripple effect that meeting caused, right? We don't know what was said in that meeting. So for all intents and purposes, it was a perfectly proper meeting. What's really triggering the sloppiness is the medical examiner coming out saying that this was homicide, there was high levels of fentanyl, but that the 8-minute and 46-second long knee to the neck was not a cause of his death. That is incredibly sloppy, especially when you consider the type of effect that statement had internationally on this case.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned not unusual, but Julie, I'll give you the final word on this. Did you find it unusual that in the statement from Mike Freeman's office, he mentioned attorney Amy Sweezy, he mentioned Patrick Lofton, but he refused to mention Deputy Hennepin County Attorney Andy Lefevre? So
yeah,
why not that third person?
I noticed that as well. Now, maybe they're going to be, he's going to be the fall guy, or maybe he forgot. I'm not really sure. There might be something that none of us know exactly in terms of what happened during that meeting or what should have and shouldn't happen during that meeting that it implicates that specific prosecutor.
Yeah, because this is a case that people want answers to. They want transparency. And hopefully we're going to get a sense of what that is, whichever way you stand on this, whichever way the evidence and the facts lead it. We want answers and we want the truth. Listen, Julie, Gigi, I appreciate you coming on. Quick analysis of some of the biggest cases we've been covering. So thank you so much, everyone out there. Until next time, until the next Law and Crime Now, stay safe, and we'll see you then.